This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
My talk today, as the title suggests, is going to focus on muscle and the importance of skeletal muscle as we age. And I'm going to talk about healthy aging as a broad concept as well. The premise of the talk really is to cover both the scientific evidence but also some practical take-home messages as well that might be useful for people in the audience who are considering some of these approaches. So thinking of this concept of healthy aging, the World Health Organization has a definition which I think is interesting to look at, because what they talk about is the healthy aging as being the process of developing and maintaining functional ability that enables well-being in older age. So they don't talk about an absence of disease. They accept this idea that age is a risk factor for a lot of lifestyle-related chronic diseases, and there's a fairly high chance. Basically 9 out of 10 people over the age of 65 will have some form of lifestyle-related chronic disease. But the question is then, how do we maintain functional ability? And what we mean by that really is functional independence. And what I'll talk about this broader concept of performance across the lifespan. So muscle mass has become something in the last number of years, I think, that people have become really aware of, this idea that we lose muscle mass as we age. And there is no doubt that occurs, and there's no doubt that there's a protective effect of lifelong exercise. So these are the type of images that we're seeing more and more now. They're quite provocative because most people can imagine their own. This is the leg here, so it's the upper part of the thigh of the leg, and the white. And let me see if this works here. It's showing up slightly here. So the white center there is the femur, the bone of the upper leg, and the grey area here is muscle, and the white area then is fat. And so if you look at a 40-year-old athlete, or you look at a 70-year-old athlete, in this case these are triathletes, so these are really extreme exercise models. But then if you look at someone who's 74 years of age and sedentary, this is an extreme example. This is what we would call sarcopenia obesity. It's where you've got large amount of fat deposition, quite an obvious loss of muscle mass, and then you've got infiltration of that muscle with fat deposition, which I'll talk about later, but that reduces muscle quality. So, like I said, this idea that muscle mass declines with age has been quite well accepted as a concept by the general public now. People are kind of aware of this. This is what it should actually look more like. This is a less extreme version, but you still see the same features where you've got lipid or fat deposition within the muscle, and you've got an increase in fat mass around that muscle, and obviously a shrinking of the muscle itself. So that's what's under the hood, so to speak, under the skin. And I think seeing these images really does give people this sense that something important is happening under the skin if you're not exercising as we should. So, as I said, I introduced this term sarcopenia. It comes from the Greek, which means poverty of flesh. It was recognized as a disease 3 or 4 years ago now, and I think that as well has put it on the map as a concept. The definition, a lot of people will talk about, there's a loss of muscle mass as we age, that's sarcopenia. That's actually not what the definition is. The most recent definition from the European Working Group on sarcopenia in older persons will say that it's a progressive and generalized skeletal muscle disorder that is associated with increased likelihood of adverse outcomes, including falls, fractures, physical disability, and mortality. Now, in the definitions, the primary point that people look for is a loss of muscle strength. Then they will look for a loss of muscle mass, and if it's severe sarcopenia, there will also be a decline in various measures of performance. So it's incorrect to say that it should only be a decline in muscle mass. It's actually a decline in function. And I'm laboring this point a little bit because I'm going to talk about changes in strength and function during this talk, as opposed necessarily to changes in muscle mass, because changing muscle mass is actually a difficult thing to do, whereas we can see quite big gains in muscle strength and function with, you'll see fairly small amounts of exercise. But let me just say about this muscle wasting idea. The idea that we would lose muscle size across a range of different conditions has been very well established. Now, under each one of these conditions that I've listed here, the the time course of the loss of muscle, the severity of the loss of muscle, the molecular mechanisms that regulate that loss of muscle, they're quite different across these. But fundamentally, at the bottom of this, if people are losing functional independence as a result of some of these conditions, it's because of this loss of muscle mass and muscle function that goes with it. Again, something that maybe many of you in this audience are probably aware of is there's this idea that there's a strong link between the size of the muscle and the function of a muscle. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship. So you can have situations where you can gain back function without necessarily gaining back muscle size. And it's an important distinction to make when you think about, like I said, the difficulties that there can be in terms of gaining muscle. So to illustrate this is data from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. It's looking at leg strength, so the knee extensors, which is again this quadricep muscle of the upper thigh, and also looking at leg lean mass measured by something known as a Dexa Scan. And what you see here across the age ranges is that the amount of muscle mass and strength declines are fairly, they're matched relatively well up until a certain age, after which there's a disproportionate loss of strength and not such a large loss of mass. So the point here really is that the rate of decline is steeper with older age, but the decline in strength, which is a measure of function, is substantially greater than the decline in mass when we get into the over 75 type of age range. So, brings me to this point about function and why should we be interested in function and how do we measure function or functional capacity in older adults. So the first thing I'll talk about is gait speed, so walking speed, and the reason this is important is because there's, again, fairly strong evidence that it predicts life expectancy. So this is modeling from individuals here in the US, and this is a complicated looking slide, but I'll try and explain it in simple terms. What you're looking at here is the expected survival on the y-axis, depending on a person's age at the time that their walking speed has been measured. So let me just use this top left example here. So if someone at the age of 65 years of age has a walking speed of 1.6 meters per second, their life expectancy is predicted to be another 32 years. In other words, they would live into their late 90s. If, on the other hand, they had a walking speed below or at the cutoff for sarcopenia, this definition of sarcopenia, then their life expectancy would be around about 15 years, which would mean they would live to 80. Again, this is a prediction. It's not your fate if this is the case, but it's a prediction. Of course, what you could also suggest is that if their walking speed was that slow at that time, and to give a rough example, you would not be able to cross the street in the time that is allowed by a typical pedestrian crossing if your walking speed was slower than that. And you could probably extend that and think that maybe actually overall life, quality of life would be reduced in that situation. So what we're suggesting here really is walking speed is a predictor of life expectancy, but also a predictor of someone's overall well-being. And the slower someone's walking speed is, the less likely they are to live well, again, like I said, in their later years. So that's walking speed, but I'm going to focus quite a bit on strength and strength training in this talk. So let's look at what the strength tell us about survival. So in this particular study, they looked at, they brought people into a lab, they measured their chest press strength, so their upper body strength, this push in action. They also measured their leg press strength, and they put those two scores together to come up with a composite score of whole body strength. And what they then did was to break the population up into over 60s and under 60s, and then break each of those groups up into the weakest 1/3, the middle 1/3, and the strongest 1/3 of the population. And the pattern is really quite stark in the over 60s. What it shows is that the death rate was halved in the strongest 1/3 of the population in that over 60 category. So there's a protective effect of being strong in later life. So then the question becomes, okay, we've got these exercise guidelines that tell us we should do around about 150 minutes of aerobic exercise per week. They also tell us we should do 2 sessions of strength training in a week. And those two things we should be doing all of that. In fact, it's not one or the other. And again, you'll see later, there's sometimes this perception that it's one or the other, when in fact it should be both. So in this particular study, they looked at, again, the all-cause mortality in a period of follow-up. And what you see here is that if you just do either one of the guidelines, it's around about a 20% reduction compared to not doing anything at all. Whereas if you do both, there's a slightly additive effect there, where there's a 29% reduction in all-cause mortality in follow-up. So the idea here is that doing both aerobic and strength-based exercise is going to confer an added benefit over doing one or the other alone. Let me just point to something in the bottom left-hand corner, and apologies for people at the back, the writing is quite small here. But when you look at the percentage of adults meeting these guidelines, and this is across the population, this is not just older adults, what you're seeing here is that there's only 36% are meeting the aerobic guidelines, 3.4% are meeting the strength guidelines, 5.5% are meeting both. So aside from the fact that we know that there are some benefits to meeting these guidelines, the number of people actually doing that is really quite small. And in particular, on the strength side of things, it's a really small proportion of the population actually get these 2 strengthening sessions done per week. I often get a question, I think this is an important point to make, is, and you'll see in some of the research that we've done, older adults don't tend to like to go to gym type environments, and I'll explore some of that and why that's the case in a few slides' time. So I think it's worth looking at this question about, compared to doing no strength exercise at all, does it matter if you do gym-based, or does it matter if you just use your own body weight? And I'm going to talk about body weight exercise in a while, but the point here that I just want to make is that there's very little difference as to whether you go to a gym to do your workouts or whether you use your own body weight at home. There are other aspects, social aspects, that I'll talk about as well, but just if you purely want to ask the question, should I go to the gym or can I do my body weight based exercises at home, there's no real difference shown by this particular type of analysis. Which brings me to the question of healthy aging as a lifelong process. And this was a model that was introduced by the World Health Organization over 20 years ago now at this stage. And on the y-axis, what you're looking at is functional capacity or functional ability that I mentioned earlier. What you've got on the x-axis is age, and the lines that you're seeing here are 2 theoretical trajectories that you might see in someone's life across the whole of the life course. So in early life, there'd be gains in functional capacity as from birth up to a certain age. And as I tell people nowadays, this age used to be 35, but each year I present, it gets a little year later. So currently this peak occurs at 37, and it's getting, as I said, year by year, predicting it's getting later. But the trajectories that then happen after that are a reflection of someone's lifestyle habits later on in life. So there's an inevitable decline in strength or functional capacity versus a more rapid decline that can occur. Again, this is theoretical for now. There are 2 lines here. One would be indicative of reduced performance, which would be something like a definition of sarcopenia or perhaps frailty. And then dropping below an even lower threshold, that would be the so-called disability threshold, where someone either needs to be rehabilitated, their quality of life is reduced, they need caregivers, and so on. And so the question really becomes, what are the factors in our lifestyles that can make sure that our decline is relatively slow? Or what is happening that's causing these more rapid declines, and how could they possibly be avoided or mitigated? And of course, there's probably another line that we could add to this particular graph, which is that someone could be in relatively steep decline, but with an improvement in certain lifestyle factors, particularly the use of resistance exercise, maybe they can bend that trajectory and stay above that disability threshold. Now, in the strongest of the strong, it's worth pointing out something like this. So this is a powerlifter called David Ricks. And powerlifting is interesting because it's a combination of squat, bench press, and deadlift. And people are trying to lift as much as they can. It's not a model, I would say, for all older adults. But this is David Ricks, who on his 60th birthday did squats, which is the equivalent of 610 pounds. I had to convert this to pounds just so it's in this system. But if you look at his trajectory, so again, like I said about powerlifting, you've got these 3 lifts, and everyone's scores, if they compete in an event, are recorded. There's a website where you can find everyone's scores going back years and years and years. So if you were to take David Ricks' career trajectory, you can see that he started off lifting, recorded lifts in his 20s, and his peak is still somewhere in the region of 40 to 50. But if you look closely at the data, he's still hitting really big scores, into his 50th year, and then there's more of a decline as he moves towards the 60s. So the point is that it's not necessarily that this peak that occurs in our strength and function is in our 30s. It can be much later in life, again, depending on the approach that you take to training and so on. Now, this is daunting, talking about 700-pound squats and deadlifts. I know that's not for this audience, but that idea that this idea of lifting plates and so on could be daunting, or not know what you do. This comes up repeatedly when I speak to older adults, and I'll talk about some of our research on this as we go along. Now, the other thing then is what could be something that contributes to this more rapid trajectory. So why do some people lose muscle and mass and strength so much more quickly? So this is a study that looks at enforced bed rest. It's a model that's used in research, and it kind of it mimics or models what might be happening when someone has an acute hospitalization. So a scenario where you're in a bed for a week to 10 days to maybe 2 weeks. So it can be a fall leading to a fracture, it can be influenza, something like pneumonia, any cardiac event or cerebrovascular event. These are the types of things where someone might be bedridden for a week or 2 weeks. And so this particular study looked at this is two separate studies, but I'm just putting the data together here. You're looking at loss of lean body mass in 28 days in young individuals, versus 10 days in healthy older adults, and again looking at the same, how much muscle was lost during enforced bed rest. So in 10 days of inactivity in older adults, they're losing about 10% of their leg lean mass. And what we're saying here really is that this type of a bed rest can pose a threat to the maintenance of muscle mass and functional capacity. And the numbers that are often used is that we would lose around about 1% of our muscle mass per year after middle age. So this 10% that's lost in 10 days is the equivalent of a decade's worth of muscle. In other words, we're talking about losing a year's worth of muscle per day of enforced bed rest in a situation like this. And we call this particular scenario disuse atrophy. So atrophy is a term that means loss of muscle in this case as a consequence of disuse. So this has led some authors to propose what's known as the catabolic crisis model of loss of muscle mass. And again, remembering that when you're losing muscle mass, you're inevitably losing a certain amount of function with each one of these episodes. And so what you're seeing here is this more rapid trajectory is being caused by one episode per decade, which may be just, like I discussed on the previous slide, 10 to 14 days of bed rest, where you get a rapid decline in muscle mass and potentially function as well, where you get a small amount of rehabilitation, but maybe not enough to return to the previous baseline. And then that occurs repeatedly over the decades. Now, once per decade is what's being represented here. This could be once every other year, or maybe it happens once a year to certain individuals, and that's when you get this more rapid decline and escalates rather quickly. Because one of the issues is that the more, let's call it unhealthy that an individual is, the more rapidly they will lose their muscle mass during periods of inactivity. So it's a escalating situation, like I described, when you've got multiple episodes of acute illness that are leading to hospitalization and being in a bed. And the antidote to it is exercise and to a certain extent nutrition intervention as well. One last thing I'll say before I get into some of our research is that this on the right-hand side is the information I showed you before, but one of the other things that occurs when you lose lean mass is that you lose what's a very important reservoir for the disposal of glucose. So everyone's heard of diabetes and the epidemic that's occurring with obesity and diabetes associated with that. But one of the primary defects in diabetes is that where we typically dispose of a lot of our glucose or the sugar in our blood is the muscle. And in type 2 diabetics, as is shown here on the right, that ability to put glucose away, dispose of it into muscle, is reduced. Now, if you've got that already occurring with diabetes, and on top of that you're now losing muscle, you're then losing or reducing the reservoir, which worsens type 2 diabetes, and in actual fact will also worsen this risk of sarcopenia. The two are very difficult to separate, which causes the other to be worsened. What I'm getting to is that insulin resistance and this loss of muscle mass and function are, to my mind, the primary threats to healthy aging in older adults. So there has been some interest in the idea of pharmacotherapies, partly to do with this idea that sarcopenia is now recognized as a clinical condition. And a review came out earlier this year that described the development of some of these pharmacotherapies and their success, in inverted commas, because actually there hasn't been much success. So I'm not, again, this is just small print, but it's just to point out that there are several of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world are in this space of trying to develop pharmacotherapeutics against age-related loss of muscle mass. And what I can say from the conclusion of this paper, and having seen a lot of this data presented at conferences, is that many of them, are the currently available ones, fail to improve muscle function or patient-reported outcomes. So I won't read through this in too much detail, but essentially what this is saying is that if you look at the idea that we're losing muscle mass, a lot of these drugs have been relatively successful in increasing muscle mass that's been lost. But this ultimately hasn't translated into an improvement in strength or patient physical function. So it goes back to this point that I made before, that there are times when the relationship between muscle size and muscle function are uncoupled. And this is an example of that. So you can take a drug, in this case, that can increase muscle mass, and there are certain scenarios where that could be valuable, independent of an increase in strength. But generally speaking, we'd be trying to increase strength and we'd be trying to increase function. And so the analogy that I use in this scenario is to say that taking a drug like this that increases size but doesn't improve strength or function, it's like putting new wheels on a car but not fixing the transmission, because simply we can't get the message to the muscle to work and to be stronger and to function better. So my research over the last 15 years has spanned a whole range of different aspects, but mostly have focused on performance in the broadest sense, looking at athletes, as you can see on the left-hand side, and more recently moving into this area of healthy aging and everything goes with it. And what we're really interested in is this idea of the transition from robust health down to frailty or sarcopenia down to disability. Are there points along this continuum that we can reverse or slow the trajectory of this path in order to be able to keep people healthier for longer? So there are guidelines that have, the most recent ones are now over 10 years old. I expect there'll be a new position stand from the ACSM relatively soon, although not much has changed. There's simply this idea of an activity pyramid. You do what most people are familiar with, which is 3 to 5 times a week. You do aerobic exercise. 3+ times a week, you do some form of strengthening and stretching, so flexibility. Every day, you try to be active, and you try to minimize the amount of time spent sitting. They're the broad guidelines. And then if you look at this in older adults, there's a whole continuum of physical activity in older adults, ranging from master athletes, which Bonnie just told me she's a master athlete, wherever she is. So that was impressive to hear about. So these are people who compete in sport. In athletics, or you've right down to people who never leave the bed, and there's a whole spectrum, like I said, of things in between here. So when we think about exercise in the older adult, I think it's worth remembering this particular quote, which is, "The good physician treats the disease, the great physician treats the patient who has the disease." In other words, whatever we're doing with exercise prescription, shown here within this particular figure here, we need to prescribe exercise that's relevant to the patient, the individual, in terms of their ability and in terms of the functional limitations or the disease that they have at the time that they begin their exercise program. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm not going to be able to give a one-size-fits-all recommendation in this talk, but I'm going to try and explain some of the research that we've done in this space to try and look at what works well in older adults. So we have some key questions. One of the things that comes up repeatedly is that, oh, you're telling me to do 3 to 5 times of aerobic exercise, you're telling me to do 2 or more sessions of strength exercise or resistance exercise. That's an awful lot of exercise. Where do I find the time to do it? And there's this kind of perception that it has to be done on different days, when in fact you can do these sessions together, and that's called concurrent exercise training. It's been around for a long time. It hasn't been well studied in older adults for the simple reason that most of the time the types of interventions, we believe anyway, have been either very aggressive in the sense that they've asked the older adults to do a lot of exercise, or they've asked them to do aerobic plus a resistance, which means that you double the amount of time spent in exercise compared to either one of them alone. So what we tried to do in our research was to look at what, I should have maybe highlighted this word here, time matched. In other words, we had an aerobic training group, we had a strength training group, And then we did a group that did half of the aerobic exercise and half of the resistance exercise or strength exercise, so that in essence they were doing the same total amount of time of exercise per week. So we were interested in what would the effect be, and then also what was the time course of change in those older adults. So the study looked like this. We had 21 individuals in each group, male and female, all over the age of 65. We had a control group who did their usual activity. We had this aerobic training group, strength training group, and then the group that did half and half. And each of the groups were doing a half-hour session 3 times a week. That was the total exercise requirement. And we measured them at before, middle, and after 12 weeks of training. Now, what you're going to see repeatedly in the research is these are 12-week intervention studies, and that's a whole other debate as to why that's the case, but anyway, that's the model that we've used. Now, we used this particular type of training, which is, this is called a Milan circle. And there's a few interesting features about this. It's smart card enabled, which in essence means that you have your own, trainer has got their own individual card. Whatever machine they get on and they slip in their card, all of the levers and adjustments adjust automatically, so that it's set up once and the person can kind of use it as they want. It records all the lifts that you've done, the amount of work that you're doing, so on and so forth. It's very useful for the type of research that we can do, and it's available in some gyms. But the other thing that it does is it allows people to train in small groups. So we were typically training our older adults in groups of 4 to 6 individuals. You saw that we had 63 people who were training in the study itself. So there was an interaction effect between the individuals as they trained, which I'm going to get to in a few slides' time. But this was all supervised, like I said, 3 by 30 minutes essentially per week for 12 weeks. And what did we find? So all the graphs are going to look the same. You've got a control group on the left, then the aerobic group, the resistance or strength training group, and then the concurrent training group. And what you see in this particular slide is that in terms of strength of the leg, measured by leg press, that the concurrent training group, so the ones that did both aerobic and resistance exercise, had better responses to training than either group alone, even though they did only the same amount of exercise. Now, in this case, we saw very little difference in lean body mass. So they didn't increase their muscle during this time. And again, this is a point that I touched on earlier in the talk, is that it's quite difficult to change muscle mass in an older adult, whereas you can see quite large increases in strength during that time, about a 50% increase in strength in the concurrent training group. However, one of the interesting things that came out of this study and made a few headlines at the time was that the concurrent training group lost more body fat in the trunk area during that time. So going back to that point about metabolic disease and type 2 diabetes, a lot of the problem can be with increased adiposity or fat mass of the trunk area. And when we measured trunk fat, we saw very little change in the 2 other groups, but in whatever about the concurrent exercise training, whatever way it had been structured or the way that people responded to it, we saw this decrease in trunk fat mass. So that's an interesting thing. You're kind of getting more bang for your buck by using concurrent exercise training, even though it's the same amount of total time spent training as the other 2 groups combined. So, as I said, there's a kind of key question that comes out of this, and I'll use colloquial terms. What happens when the party's over? So we supervise these older adults for 12 weeks, 3 times a week for 12 weeks, and then at the end of that time period, we let them out into the wild to do whatever they wanted for the next 12 months. And we followed them up 1 year later to look at where they had got to with their training and their performance. So the news isn't good, as you might expect. So first thing I'll say is that when we followed up a year later, 85% of them were still engaged in aerobic exercise. So people were still able to go out and do their 30-minute walks 3 to 5 times a week, that kind of thing. Only 17 or 18% were still involved in strength training. So 1 in every 5 people were involved in strength training. This is surprising because you'll see one of the quotes. We interviewed them afterwards, and I'll share some of those quotes in a second. But so this is the first point to make, is that they didn't stay engaged, I should say, with resistance exercise. So what happened? So what we saw was that fat mass trended back upwards. Trunk fat in particular trended back upwards. We saw a small loss of lean body mass, and in particular we saw a loss of what's called the appendicular lean mass, which is the muscle of the arms and the legs, and that's often used as a diagnostic again for low muscle mass in sarcopenia. So these are all bad occurrences. Now, they're kind of consistent with the idea that we lose muscle mass as we age, but we were a bit surprised obviously by this. And then the other thing was that the strength losses were really quite stark, and in this case here, this is called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. There was also a decline, statistically significant decline in cognitive function over that year as well. So despite the fact that most people remained engaged in aerobic exercise, very few of them remained engaged in strength-based training, and the evidence in terms of losses of strength were there to be seen. So as part of this follow-up design that we were working on, we interviewed 12 individuals. So we did in-depth interviews with 12 of the individuals who were in the training study, and began to ask them questions. And there's a whole process you go through, qualitative research, in terms of identifying themes and then taking out representative quotes. It's in this paper that we've published, but I'll give you a couple of the highlights. So one of the things we found was that many participants lacked an understanding of exercise prescription prior to the intervention. I come across this all the time. So I learned that aerobic training was not really sufficient for complete health. Resistance training, i.e. strength training, is very important, and it's very appropriate for someone of my age. Now, despite that, again, we only show quotes that repeatedly come up, or themes that repeatedly come up. So this did come up again and again in our interviews, yet we saw that very few people still engaged in resistance training, even though they knew that it was beneficial to their health as an older adult. So what might explain that? In terms of facilitator, what made people go to the gym? Well, I mentioned earlier about the fact they trained in small groups. So they actually said that for people over 70 sort of thing, that's an Irish saying, by the way, sort of thing, it means kind of, or something like that. Group activity, I think, is incredibly important because there's a social element to it, there's social interaction. So again, this repeatedly came up that older adults liked the fact that they were training with people of the same age, mindset, ability, so on and so forth in the type of gym setup that we had. And then the other one is that if they have a buddy, effectively, in this case it was a man saying that if he went with his wife, that was good to motivate one another. So the idea of training older adults in groups of like-minded individuals, of their contemporaries, so to speak, and also of having kind of buddy systems is something that's valuable. And again, when people are left to their own devices, they don't tend to get that. So that was a facilitator. In terms of a barrier, this was a surprise to us. We did this research in South Dublin, which is the wealthiest part of Ireland to a large extent, and what people were saying, remember these are retirees, they were saying the cost was a factor. The gym is so expensive. Cost is a factor because with the retirement pension, you have less disposable income. So even though these were all university alumni and they were fairly living, I should say, in a well-to-do part of the country, cost was a factor. And in terms of the cost of this particular gym, it was $125, or euro, I should say, so about $140 roughly per month. And they felt that was expensive. And then the other element to it was that the constraint of the gym environment, or the perceptions of the gym environment. So basically someone says, I don't like the gym at all, too claustrophobic, I won't be going back, no social aspect, it's not social, people just go in and get out. And then this guy down here says, I hate fit people. Well, he says, he tries to row back from it, then he says, well, you know what I mean, so. Anyway, the point though is that when you factor in the facilitator, so it's things like working together and, as I said, working out with their contemporaries, having some kind of social element to it, but then also removing barriers like cost and this intimidating gym environment. This is a thing that we see repeatedly come up. So, I mean, there's some things that people could think about from that point of view in terms of offering gym services to older adults. But a piece of work came out, again now it's 10 years, that talked about what was called at that time uncomplicated resistance exercise training. This is from Stuart Phillips at McMaster University. And the premise of this paper, without going into all the details, what they found, their suggestion was that one of the problems with why we can't adopt resistance training in older adults is because there's this perception that it's too complicated, and that there is an emphasis in the research on all of these variables that are important for resistance training. But for someone who just needs to go out and exercise to improve their strength and function, it actually doesn't have to be that complicated. And so we were interested in this question: is can you use an uncomplicated approach to resistance training, and can it be similar in terms of traditional resistance training? So what we consider to be uncomplicated, but again this is a perceptual thing, but it was to use body weight exercise and resistance bands as part of the training modality. But one of the key things that we did in this particular study is we really emphasized the control of movement and the speed of movement. And I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty details about it, but if you control this variable called time under tension, you can provide a very strong stimulus to the muscles using just body weight alone. Again, I'll show a couple of pieces of data from this slide, but one, in this particular study, we were able to show a fairly large increase in lean body mass in response to, again, 12 weeks of training. In this case, these sessions are about 45 minutes in length. It was about a 1 kg increase in whole body lean mass, which is about a 2% increase overall. And that, again, if you think about 1% per decade, that's, putting about 2 years worth of muscle back on the body for those older adults. And we saw things like a small improvement in walking speed. We saw a small improvement in the ability to get up and down out of a chair. The number of repetitions could be provided in 30 seconds. So the idea here really was that using bodyweight exercises and using resistance bands and just being careful about the control of time under tension could really produce fairly large increases in both size and function. I think it's a key message. Again, not everything has to happen in one of these traditional gym environments with very heavy weights or heavy lifting. It doesn't have to be like that. So turning now to a little bit on nutrition, because there's, as I said, our Bonnie introduced my research. We are interested in the synergy between nutrition and exercise, and so in the context of muscle, when we're thinking about it as a concept, we generally think about the protein synthesis, as it's called, which is an anabolic response. It's the building of new muscle. Or we think about catabolic responses or protein breakdown occurring. And there is one particular amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. So when you eat a food that contains a certain amount of protein, the digestion and what leads to the availability of nutrients in your blood are amino acids, and these amino acids then are the building blocks of tissues in the body, including muscle. But there's one particular amino acid called leucine, which is known to be the trigger for the anabolic response to a meal. So that'll be important when I come back to how we should implement this later on. But generally speaking, the concept is this: if you want muscle growth to occur, you have to have synthesis greater than breakdown for a prolonged period of time, or if wasting is occurring, it's because breakdown is greater than synthesis for a prolonged period of time. So in the aging and exercise training and nutrition paradigm, what we're essentially trying to do is the catabolic effects of age-associated declines in muscle health are probably caused by reduced movement, reduced daily protein intake, and something known as anabolic resistance, which I'll talk about in a second. And to try and overcome those, we then try to use exercise training because that's a potent anabolic stimulus. We then time the protein and essential amino acids around the exercise session, but also other parts of the day, which I'll talk about. And there are some other elements around other nutrients, such as omega-3 fatty acids, which can improve anabolic sensitivity. So that's the antidote to anabolic resistance. So conceptually, what this looks like is that each time we consume a meal that contains protein, we get a small rise in muscle protein synthesis, and in between meals you get a decline, and then we eat again and it goes back up. And in a normal individual, that up and down interaction will generally mean that someone's body weight will stay stable over a prolonged period of time, or the muscle mass will be stable over a prolonged period of time. If you have a scenario where you get a blunting of the synthesis response, or you get an acceleration of the breakdown response, that's when you tend to see loss of muscle mass occurring. When we do resistance exercise or strength-based exercise, then you enhance the anabolic sensitivity of the muscle so that the next time that you eat a protein-containing meal, you get a greater muscle protein synthesis response. And so if you repeat this combination of appropriate nutrition and exercise training over weeks and months, that's how we begin to put muscle on the body. So the question might become, what maximizes this response? Well, it turns out to be strength training combined with about 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal, and ideally providing roughly 3 grams of that amino acid leucine that I mentioned before. So one of the things that occurs is anabolic resistance, and I'm just looking at the time here, so I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, but in essence, what happens is in older adults, when you consume amino acid containing meals, so if you eat something that contains protein, in older adults there is reduced digestion and absorption. There is an extraction of amino acids in the gut, which ultimately means that less get into the bloodstream. There's also less blood flow to the muscle, which means that with less amino acids in the blood and less blood getting to the muscle, you're seeing less delivery of these amino acids, these building blocks, to the muscle itself. And therefore you get reduced uptake of amino acids into the muscle, which means that these anabolic signaling processes that are so important for that muscle protein synthesis, they're reduced. And ultimately what that appears as is that for the same amount of protein eaten by a younger individual, you don't get the same anabolic response in an older individual, and that is called anabolic resistance. There are a couple of other important factors. So one is inflammation. So if you've got a metabolic disease or some other clinical condition where you've got inflammation present, that will blunt these anabolic signaling processes. And going right back to the very start of the presentation, if you've got that infiltration of fat into the muscle, this what's called ectopic fat deposition, that will also impair these anabolic signaling processes. So there's a myriad of factors that come together, mostly produced by inactivity, perhaps inappropriate diet. Aging is a risk factor as well, one we can't change. But they all come together to reduce anabolic signaling and reduce the muscle protein synthesis response to a meal. So we need to think about ways that we can overcome this with our interventions. So one of the ways to increase muscle blood flow and the delivery of amino acids is to exercise. That can improve anabolic sensitivity, which means that these signaling processes are augmented. We can improve diet quality and to reduce inflammation and to reduce ectopic fat deposition. Again, exercise can help with these as well. We can potentially look at increasing the amount of protein that we initially put into the body, because that ultimately will kind of, if you imagine, force a bit more amino acids into the bloodstream. Or we could potentially spike in leucine, this amino acid leucine, into the foods that we eat in order to be able to, again, increase this postprandial, as it's called, amino acid delivery. So there's a variety of factors that could work. The omega-3 supplements could potentially be working somewhere around here as well, potentially dampening inflammation or potentially enhancing the sensitivity of the muscle to anabolic stimuli. Again, a lot of different ways that it can be done. I'll just focus very briefly on the protein side of things. So in essence, what we now know is that older adults require about 50% more than the RDA for protein. And so it's 1.2 grams per kg of body mass, which someone will have to convert to pounds for me, but 1.8 would it be? Or sorry, no, it'll be on the lower side, so 0.7, I think it'll be roundabout, grams per pound of body mass or thereabouts. The problem, though, is that many older adults eat less than the RDA, and the RDA is already 50% less than they need as an older adult. So what you're seeing is an awful lot of older adults not getting sufficient protein. Another opportunity we have is around exercise. Again, just in the interest of time, I'll just summarize this very briefly to say that if you compare older adults who either consume a small amount of protein immediately after the training session versus delaying that by 2 hours, what you see is that they can improve, should be this one first. Both groups can improve strength, but only the group who consume a recovery meal that contains protein immediately after the training session will increase strength to a greater extent, but will also increase their cross-sectional area of their muscles. So it's important if you do exercise that you have some sort of post-exercise protein snack. That's a useful eating occasion to try and stimulate the anabolic response. Now, this is data from our own analysis of Irish adults, 1,000 Irish adults, and we looked at their protein intakes and the sources and so on. It's a long paper, but one of the key messages, this is seen in most Western societies as well, which is called a skewed protein distribution, which in essence shows that at breakfast, we tend to eat very little protein, at lunch we tend to eat a little bit more, and at dinner we tend to eat the most of our protein. Now, this is not such a major problem, except maybe when we get into the healthy aging realm and you realize that this so-called anabolic threshold, this value that we need to get above with our protein intake, is around about 30 grams in older adults. And what you see here, particularly this is the over 65s, that all of the eating occasions, except for dinner, fail to meet this anabolic threshold. So the recommendations, there's a bit of debate in the literature about this. Some people would say, well, what we should do is try and add a little bit more protein to breakfast and a little bit more protein to lunch, and let's try and get these eating occasions above the anabolic threshold. However, there's this so-called anorexia of aging, where older adults tend to be satiated quicker than younger adults, particularly with protein-containing foods. So one of the consequences, if you really increase protein intake at breakfast, you might find that an older adult is no longer hungry at lunchtime, or their overall intake throughout the day may be suppressed a little bit. So there's no firm recommendations at this moment in time, only that we should probably try and increase protein intake, but it may be that instead of focusing on breakfast, we just try and make sure that lunch gets above that threshold. So now that we've got lunch and dinner above the threshold, so we have 2 eating occasions rather than one that's elevated above the threshold. And then there's researchers recently become interested in this idea of the nighttime snack. So right before bedtime, using a high protein meal, oftentimes it's a protein shake, but used before bedtime, because then you get this 3rd eating occasion that's above the anabolic threshold. Again, there's a lot of things still to be explored around the benefits of this in the long term, and which is the best approach to take on a person-by-person basis. But that's currently the way things are being thought about at the moment for protein intakes. So I have a summary of the different the different points here that I've more or less described there. But in essence, we focus on quality and getting it above a certain threshold. We look at a quantity that's quite a little bit higher for older adults than it is for younger adults. And then we try and have an even spread throughout the day, but being aware that in older adults, it might just be better to target 1 or 2 eating occasions to get above that threshold. There's some value in animal over plant, which I don't have time to get into right now. We should definitely have a post-exercise feed to try and enhance the anabolic response to exercise, and then pre-bed feeding might be another opportunity. Much of this work has been done with protein supplements, but there is a lot of work that's been done with food, and we became quite interested in the idea of using real food. And so I'll just tell you about our last piece of research, which is that we decided to try and coach older adults to eat more protein throughout the day. We tried to do it through a food-based approach, and we tried to base it around leucine-rich meals, which in essence was animal protein to a large extent. And we were interested in whether that could augment the training response, and we were interested in what would happen actually if you just gave them no exercise but asked them to eat more protein, what would happen. That's an interesting finding. Similar design as before that I'll just race through in the interest of time. So we had 3 groups. 1 just increased their protein intake, 1 just did exercise, 1 did exercise plus higher protein intake. We got the intakes of these adults from around 1 gram per kg of body mass up to about 1.5 to 1.6 grams per kg of body mass, which is again above the recommended. It's about twice the RDA, and it's above the recommended amount that was got above the threshold that's recommended for older adults. We use this type of approach, which is a food exchange list, where you can basically give people lists of foods and tell them how much protein is in portion size, and ask them to eat a certain amount from each, as options throughout the day. And there's a whole variety of other things that we did to try and get them to eat more. But again, like I said, it was a successful approach in terms of increasing protein intake. So we didn't see any difference in terms of the chest press. In other words, the exercise group and the nutrition plus exercise group increased to the same amount in terms of their strength. However, there was a big change for leg press. So in this particular group, there was an improvement in strength in the exercise-only group, but when we provided protein in the form of a high-protein diet, they increased their leg press strength to a much greater extent. So again, if we're talking about optimal adaptation, there's going to be an advantage to combining things like more protein throughout the day, eating it around exercise sessions, and that's evidence there. And this has been backed up previously by studies that use protein powder, but we think we were the first to use real food to achieve that. Now, one of the things, of course, that's worth pointing out is that there were modest changes in lean body mass, but this is what happened in terms of fat mass in the group that just ate protein. So you tell someone to eat more protein, which seems to be all the rage these days, if they don't do any extra exercise, or if they don't adjust their diet in any other way, they're going to put on a lot of fat. The 2 exercise groups didn't gain any fat during this period. So it's not always an idea just to eat high protein all the time, despite what a lot of people will sometimes tell you. Okay, last couple of slides then. Am I too old to exercise? This is data from people the age of 85 and above. Every single line that you see here is a pre to post measurement, and this dark line is the average, but my point here is that everyone gains in strength in this particular cohort. Even though they start off relatively weak here, they all improve over the course of 12 weeks. That's in over 85-year-olds. In other words, it's never too late to start. I can't do very much yet, we could say. Maybe add to that. This is what's known as the curvilinear response to exercise training. And so what this essentially says is that in those individuals who have the lowest baseline activity status, they are the ones who derive the most amount of benefit from doing a small amount of activity. If you're already out here, you're doing huge amounts of aerobic and strength work, maybe you're doing already 5 or 6 hours, 7 hours of exercise a week, adding on another hour is going to make very little difference. If you're down here at the very lowest point and you add an hour of exercise, whatever that may be, however that's spread throughout the week, the likelihood of that benefit being fairly large in magnitude is really obvious. So, it's never too late to start was my first point. If you can't do much, that's no problem. A little is better than nothing at all. This is a recent trend. People call themselves, everyone loves a label. I'm a non-responder is a new one. And again, when it comes to strength training, again, to summarize the I'm not going to read through it all, but just to highlight, there are no non-responders to the benefits of resistance exercise training. Yes, you may not increase muscle size. That's a possibility. But there's so many other responses to exercise training and strength-based training that there is no such thing as a non-responder to the benefits of that type of training. So, take-home messages then to wrap up. I think hopefully I've convinced you that muscle health is central to active lifestyles and aging well. There's been this increased awareness of muscle size, but I do think we need to emphasize the idea about strength and function. These are the things that are easiest to change with the right type of training. There has to be good habits though for good health in place. A lot of people know these, regular activity, appropriate diet, and so on and so forth. But if you have this desire to increase muscle size or strength as part of an aging well approach, then there has to be some form of strength training in that exercise prescription. We believe that concurrent or combined exercise training, doing aerobic and resistance within the same session, is a time-efficient model. And the minimum effective dose is probably 3 by 25 to 30 minutes per week. Although there are some researchers who would say it could be as little as once per week if the training is structured in a certain way, but I didn't have time to get into that today. Exercise should be specific to the individual, has to account for functional limitations, current health status, so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be overly intense. It doesn't have to be complex. A little is better than nothing at all. Uncomplicated strategies work really well. Offer plenty of benefits. If you want to get the optimal response, then appropriate nutrition strategies should be in place. They will maximize the gains that are got from training. Typically, or at the moment, the major focus is on protein, so it's the quantity, the distribution, the timing, and the source of that protein. And then there are other factors that I didn't have time to get into in much detail, but things like omega-3, leucine, creatine, HMB, these are all things that are being trialed at the moment, and they, again, a lot of them have positive data in terms of their support of muscle health. So with that all said, I'll just acknowledge the team of researchers that's worked with me across a couple of different institutions and the funding support that provided support for a lot of the work that we did. And aside from that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Catching is a test of function as well. So.
There we go. I'm kind of a gym rat, so I think I'm okay.
Okay.
The elephant in the room might be hormones for older adults. Have you done any looking into hormone replacement therapy for older adults and how that might impact muscle strength?
No, so we haven't looked at that directly. In the studies that we did, we always had males and females though, and we have another paper that's going to come out, and essentially when males and females are matched for relative strength, they respond very, very similarly to exercise training. So we don't think that there's a deficit in females versus males or anything like that, but to be totally honest with you, we haven't looked at the hormone replacement side of things at all.
Any research on Tai Chi, yoga, power yoga in comparison to strength training?
We haven't done that, but those are examples of exercises that will improve flexibility and also improve balance. And I didn't actually mention balance at all. Some of you may have noticed that. So we actually are not a group who study balance, but it's actually a major, let's say, blind spot in the research that we do, because the number one factor that's going to influence whether someone falls is their balance. So what I will say is that we haven't done direct research on those particular types of exercise, but they have a flexibility and a balance component, and it's not quite the same strength component as they do from the type of lifting that we're talking about, but I think they're a valuable part of exercise, the holistic exercise prescription in an older adult, yeah.
You mentioned concurrent training quite a bit, a concept I'm not really familiar with. Can you speak a little bit about what exactly that is?
Okay, so in the late 80s, the early 80s, there was this idea that if you were to train for aerobic exercise and for strength exercise at the same time, that there would be an interference between the two. In other words, you would sacrifice one or the other if you were trying to train for both. And that was probably true of people who were doing, say, sports like decathlon or sports where you actually had to try and be very aerobically fit and very strong at the same time. So that became called a concurrent training model, or the concurrent training effect, or so-called interference effect. And so concurrent really just means combined. It means doing aerobic and resistance or strength exercise at the same time, usually within the same training session is the way we think about it.
How do you combine the two?
Oh, sorry. So that's what you're asking. So in our concurrent training model, what we would have is they would do 2 exercises of strength, then they would take a break and do 4 minutes of aerobic exercise, then they would get back to 2 more machine weights, then they would go back to 4 minutes of aerobic exercise. So you're essentially doing strength, then moving to an aerobic exercise. It's kind of like interval training, except you're interspersing strength training with aerobic training. Yeah, so that circle or circuit that I described allows us to do that fairly conveniently. But if you were in a gym-based setting, essentially what you're doing is you can either do it in the model we described, where you go from short amount of strength work to a short amount of aerobic and back and forth, or you could just do 20 minutes of strength training, 20 minutes of aerobic training, and go home. That's the kind of approach, yeah.
Hi, great presentation. What are your thoughts on intermittent fasting? That's become pretty popular lately.
Oh, where do I start? You need to get an expert to speak about that. Well, I don't think it's going to be studied anytime soon in older adults, because the idea would be that if you're taking long gaps between feeding, that might be catabolic to the body. Now, that's just a speculation. I don't know if that's been studied, but it kind of flies in the face somewhat of what I was describing there of even protein distribution throughout the day. But in terms of an approach to nutrition, we've done some work with that in endurance athletes. We don't see any particularly impressive benefits or detriments in either way. We'll hopefully have that paper out within the next couple of months. It works very effectively for a lot of people, though, say in a situation where, again, this is purely practical now. If you, say, stop eating late at night, you cut out a huge amount of calories. If you skip breakfast, but you keep the rest of your day consistent as it used to be, you lose a lot of weight. So there are reasons why it produces weight loss that are probably related to calories. If some people find it easier to eat within restrictive windows and live by rules and so on, then it can have a practical value. But some of the stuff that's been demonstrated in animals in terms of the benefits of intermittent fasting, I'm hesitant to say that they'll be realized in humans, just because of the difference between rodent metabolism and human metabolism. But there are pros and cons, as there are to many approaches within diet. Yeah.
Since these studies were in older adults, did you follow any kidney function with increased protein intake?
Good question. No, we haven't looked at that. And I mean, okay, so in the younger individuals, let's say, this idea that a high protein diet causes kidney damage has kind of been debunked, more or less. And it's important as well, when I say the word high, that's actually not that high of a protein diet, relatively speaking. In terms of the percentage of calories that were coming from protein, it was probably only about 20%. And most people are usually eating around somewhere between 12 and 15%. So I think the high protein diets that have been used in animals to induce kidney damage, or in any study that's kind of even shown a trend towards any adverse effects of high protein diets. They're extremely high. And it's probably not good use of language to say high. You know, we should probably just define it as twice the RDA, for example, in this scenario. But I do take your point. We didn't measure it, so I can't say for sure. And there's not many studies that have used the type of approach that we've used, so it's probably an open question to be looked at. Yeah.
Questions we're going to take. So we'll do you, sir, in the back here. Can I toss this to you?
Could you explain or define time under tension? You had mentioned that.
Okay. So time under tension really refers to the amount of time that your muscle is performing work. So if you imagine that, you know, I'm going to use a bicep curl here. So if you imagine that if you had a dumbbell in your hand and you're going like this, the time under tension is actually relatively short. You may do 12 repetitions here and it takes 20 seconds because you're just going up and down, up and down. Now time under tension, if you really control it, what we used in our study was a 4-second, what we call eccentric or lowering contraction. So now you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, and up in 2. So we've got a 6-second cycle for 1 repetition instead of this, which is like a 2-second cycle. So that means that the time under tension, the amount of seconds that muscle is doing work is 3 or 4 times as much when you're doing controlled movements as opposed to the more rapid movements. And so again, the evidence has kind of come out in more recent years is that time under tension is a really important determinant of the anabolic response to an exercise bout. So this idea of being able to control, it may be a lighter weight, but if it's controlled, particularly the eccentric component, that provides a greater stimulus to the muscle to grow, and that's the basic concept there.
So that seems counterintuitive, but you're saying that the eccentric movements are more important than the concentric.
I won't say that they're more important in the broader sense. In the sense of what stimulates muscle growth, they're probably more important. But the concentric is the movement we tend to do when we're doing something, you know, climbing the stairs or getting up out of a chair. That's a concentric movement. So eccentric and concentric and isometric, for that matter, they're all important movements as such. But they've got various different contributions in terms of whether they contribute to function or the overload that leads to growth and so on.
Okay. You mentioned protein supplementation after exercise. Could you address specifically the powdered proteins, what to look for? There are so many on the market. What's a quality one?
Yeah, okay, so it's difficult for me to say about brands because I don't know US brands very well, but there's nothing particularly magical about any given protein powder over another to a large extent. So most of the research tends to be done on dairy proteins, which are either called whey or casein typically. But there have been studies done on egg proteins as well, powders. And then there's more and more being done on plant-based proteins like pea and rice, for example. The only consideration if you're going to go down the plant route is that they tend to have a little bit less leucine in them, so you need to have a slightly greater intake. So let's say if it was 20 grams of dairy protein, it might need to be 30 grams of pea protein in order to balance it up, you know, roughly those kind of numbers. So that's the question of the actual type, the source, whether it's a dairy or egg or plant. That's the first thing. You're typically looking for something in the region, and most of the research would show that it's in the region of 20 to 30 grams, you know, typically. So that's usually a scoop. They'll usually make it as a scoop. And then if you're looking at the brand, again, some brands are more reputable than others. There are consumers' websites now that will tell you whether the company has really put in the powder what they say they put in the powder. They're definitely worth looking up. But generally, the rule of thumb I often use is try and find the product with the least amount of ingredients, because that's going to have probably the purest source that's there. Again, we have to trust that the ingredients list is correct. But if you can get, let's say, the highest proportion of the ingredients list being just the protein powder, that's usually the safest bet to go with. Yeah.
Well, Brendan, thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful talk.